Hey guys, this is the breakdown video for the solo character I use in my videos that a few people requested. I'm just uploading Act 3 for now since I think that's the act people would be most interested in, and honestly I ran out of the energy to make the Act 1 and 2 parts right now. I may make an Act 1 and 2 video later, but I'm not sure since it's a bit of effort to make this kind of video when only like 2 or 3 people are even going to see it. I also just wanted to quickly preface this video by stating that this is in no way an optimal build. There are probably going to be a lot of mistakes, inefficient things, or things that could have been done better that you may notice while watching this video, because before creating this character I hadn't really read any guides or watched any YouTube videos and other people's builds. I think the only exception, or the main exception to that statement, is the Gloves of the Automaton with the Form of Artifice buff. Anyways, this is really just the result of me trying to see what I could come up with independently, as well as the exploits that I noticed along the way during my playthrough of the game. Anyways, let's get into it, starting with the classes of the build. So the first class listed here is Paladin. We take 5 levels in Paladin for multiple reasons. Reason number 1 is Divine Smite, and reason number 2 is because as a martial class it gives us access to extra attacks. We take the Oath of Devotion subclass because it gives us access to the Sanctuary spell. Sanctuary is a very powerful spell when you're using a single character or a solo character. You can use it defensively, obviously, but you can also use it offensively. And what I mean by offensive uses of Sanctuary is enemy units tend to cluster around you when you have this cast on yourself, so even though they can't target you, they will still approach you and then end their turn. So when it comes back to being your turn again, you have a bunch of enemy units that are all clustered in one spot, which sets them up for a nice AoE attack or AoE spell to deal a lot of damage all at once. A second use of Sanctuary is as a pre-battle buff, so you can cast Sanctuary on yourself before battle begins to guarantee that you're not going to be attacked before your first turn. And a third use of Sanctuary is to cast it on yourself at the end of your third turn on Potion of Speed. That way, when you are struck with the lethargic status effect that occurs at the end of Potion of Speed, you can't be attacked during this period. Other benefits of the Oath of Devotion subclass are not as important, but it does give us access to Sacred Weapon, which for us will give us +3 to our attack rolls for 10 turns. And that doesn't require any concentration. At level 4 for this Paladin, we're going to choose the Feat Sharpshooter, because we're mostly going to be using a bow for this build. The fighting style we choose doesn't really matter, but I chose defense. Level 2 Fighter, we're taking this because we want Action Surge. Gives you an extra action once per short rest. And we are taking the 2-weapon fighting style because we are going to be dual wielding daggers, and the 2-weapon fighting style allows us to add our relevant ability score modifier to the attack rolls and the damage rolls of your offhand weapon. The level 2 Warlock is for defensive reasons. The patron we choose is the Great Old One, and that gives us Mortal Reminder, which we will mostly be using defensively. And at level 2 we get to choose Eldritch Invocations, and the Eldritch Invocation that's most important to us is Devil's Sight. So why are these two abilities that Warlock gives us sort of really good defensive tactics? Well, with Darkness, you can't really, or enemies can't make ranged weapon or spell attacks into it. So if we have Devil's Sight, we can just sit in a little cloud of darkness and it acts as a force field for us. Enemies that lack the ability to see in magical darkness will be unable to make any sort of ranged attacks, and again that's both weapon and spell attacks at us. And interestingly, melee weapon enemies, or enemies that will need to get to melee range to hit us, they frequently will not enter darkness. To me it seems that that's contingent on your armor class. If you have a really low armor class, they'll still enter the darkness to try to hit you, but if your armor class is high enough, it seems to pretty effectively deter them. And this is probably because if they enter darkness, they will have disadvantage on attack rolls against you, and you will have advantage on attack rolls against them. So So how do you get darkness? So you can use the spell to conjure darkness, which will give you a very large area of effect for darkness, or you can use arrows of darkness, which will create a smaller area of effect for only 3 turns, which is less than the spell, but it's still very useful because that counts as an attack. And so you could shoot an arrow of darkness either just on the ground around you or at an enemy to do damage, and then you'll still have another attack available for the action that you used to create that little area of darkness. Okay, going back to Mortal Reminder and how that comes into play. So Mortal Reminder is a passive ability that the Great Old One grants us, and what it says is if an enemy is hit and it's a critical hit, they are going to be frightened for 1 turn unless they succeed a saving throw. Additionally, any enemies that are within close proximity to that enemy that got or that had a critical hit scored against them, they also will be frightened unless they make a saving throw against the Mortal Reminder passive ability. And it's very useful because although we have sort of negated the threat of ranged spell and ranged weapon attacks against us, and we've mostly deterred enemies with melee attacks from hitting us, there will still be enemies that try to enter the darkness to hit us, and they can potentially succeed. Now, if we frighten those enemies, then they can't move, meaning they can't even approach us in the first place. So that's sort of how Mortal Reminder and Darkness work together to be a really useful defensive shield for us. I think the more experience you have, and if you kind of already know your enemies' movesets and behaviors, the level 2 Warlock class becomes less relevant. I think if I were to make this build all over again, I would probably forego taking the level 2 Warlock, and I would either put 1 more level in Thief or 2 more levels in Fighter. This would allow us to get the Alert feat, which would give us +5 to Initiative. This would be this would make it so we wouldn't have to cast Sanctuary on ourselves before combat, since we would almost be guaranteed to go first in every fight, given our high initiative roll, even without the Alert feat. If we still wanted to see in darkness, we could use the Eversight Ring, and if we still wanted the Mortal Reminder debuff, we could just choose the option of putting 1 more level in Rogue, but keeping the level 1 Great Old One Warlock. The level 3 Rogue, we are using 1 because level 1 rogues give us expertise, and we need expertise in Sleight of Hand, so we can steal everything. We're going to be stealing lots of scrolls, lots of arrows, potions, elixirs, and crafting materials, so having expertise in Rogue is essential. The level 3 subclass that we're going to take is Thief because it gives us an extra bonus action, and we'll need that extra bonus action for our Band of the Mystic Scoundrel. We want to fully take advantage of this ring, and we do this by having 2 bonus actions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Going to the statistics of our character, the only 2 that are relevant are Dexterity, which we want to get to 20, and Charisma, which we want to get to 16. We get to 20 Dexterity by using Auntie Ethel's Boon from Act 1 to get +1 in Dexterity, and then we do +2 from the Thief's Memory, which can be obtained by the Mirror of Loss in the House of Grief. The Charisma of 16, we just get that by our base stats. So going through the armor and weapons, the first is the Helmet of Arcane Acuity, which is critical to the build. It essentially says that whenever you successfully land a weapon attack on an enemy, you gain 2 stacks of Arcane Acuity to a maximum of 10. And what Arcane Acuity is, well, for this build, the only thing that's relevant is it gives us +2 to our spell save DC. So, +1 to our spell save DC. So for every Arcane Acuity stack, we get +1 to our spell save DC. And this works really well. The best way to do this is essentially the arrow of many targets, because you can hit up to 4 enemies with 1 arrow of many targets. And that means that in many scenarios, shooting one of these arrows using 1 attack will give us +8 to our spell save DC. And we're essentially almost at our max just with a single attack. This will be very synergistic with our Band of the Mystic Scoundrel ring that will allow us to cast Hold Monster, Hold Person, etc. So the Cloak of Displacement is not important, it's just a good cloak, so I'm wearing it. Similarly, these boots, Helldusk boots, are not important, they're just good, so I'm wearing them. The armor that we're using is Elegant Studded Leather, and that's because we want +2 to our initiative rolls to help increase the chance that we go first during the battle. The gloves that we're going to be carrying 4 different gloves actually. 2 of them will be used for combat, the Helldusk gloves and the Legacy of the Masters. Primarily we're going to be using Helldusk gloves because it gives us 1 to 6 fire damage, and that's going to be synergistic for one of the combos that we use. That combo being Arrow of Many Targets, Helldusk gloves, and Oil of Combustion. So how this works is that you coat your weapon in Oil of Combustion. When Oil of Combustion, or whenever your weapon hits an enemy, they get coated with the Oil of Combustion status effect. If they take fire damage, then Oil of Combustion causes them to explode, dealing 3 to 18 damage, fire damage to themselves and to any creatures within a certain radius. I don't know what the radius is off the top of my head. I'm going to guess it's maybe 6 meters, but it might be less. Or more, I'm not sure. So we want to use this with Arrow of Many Targets because then that maximizes the number of enemies that we can coat with Oil of Combustion. And obviously the Helldusk gloves will be our source of fire damage to activate the Oil of Combustion explosion. And now the best way to use this is if you have a lot of enemies clustered close together, then you would hit them with your Arrow of Many Targets, because when they all explode, each of those explosions will deal damage to each other enemy in the vicinity. So they're not just dealing 3 to 18 damage to themselves, they're each doing 3 to 18 damage to each other. So if you have 4 enemies, which is again the number of enemies that Arrow of Many Targets can hit that are standing close together, and they all explode, they each will take 4 times 3 to 18 damage, so they'll each take 12 to 72 damage, I believe. I think that's right, 12 to 72 damage, in addition to the obviously regular damage that we'd be doing to them. And so that's a way for our generally low damage build to put out a lot of damage every other turn to multiple enemies. Legacy of the Masters is just to be worn if the enemy is immune to fire damage, and making Helldusk gloves irrelevant. So these are kind of your backup gloves. The other gloves that we're using are Gloves of Thievery, which will not be used in combat. It's just a out of combat glove that gives us advantage on sleight of hand checks, meaning that it decreases the risk of us getting a critical fail on a sleight of hand check to 1 out of 400, and obviously will increase the chance of success as well. The gloves that the other gloves that we'll be carrying around are the Gloves of the Automaton. You get this in Act 2 from, I think, Barkus. And these are not going to be used during combat, they're just going to be used to buff ourselves before combat. We're going to use their bonus action right before combat called Circuit G Interface, which will give us 10 turns of attack roll advantage and 10 turns of lightning resistance without the need for concentration. Once we activate its ability, we simply swap them out for Helldusk gloves or Legacy of the Masters. The ring that we're using is the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel. It's super important to the build, and what it says is that after you connect a successful weapon attack, you get to cast an illusion or enchantment spell as a bonus action. For us, we're going to have 2 bonus actions, so we'll be able to do this twice per turn. And the only spells that we're really going to be using with this are the Hold Monster spell, the Hold Person spell, and Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is kind of the second line spell in the case that the enemy is immune to Hold Monster or Hold Person, and that's going to be your undead enemies and Sarabak primarily. How we're going to be using, or how we're going to be actually acquiring the ability to use Hold Monster or Hold Person is by stealing Hold Monster and Hold Person scrolls. You can also steal Tasha's Hideous Laughter scrolls, but as a Warlock, you'll have access to Tasha's Hideous Laughter. The other ring that we are wearing, I also wanted to mention, this is obviously going to be very good with the Helmet of Arcane Acuity because we're going to have so much spell save DC bonuses that no enemy's ever really going to succeed to throw against our Hold Monster and Hold Person spells unless they roll like a natural 20 or something. Alright, the other ring is, the second ring is not as important as the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel ring. I tend to use Strange Conduit ring, Killer Sweetheart in this slot, just because they can increase your damage in certain situations. I do use the Smuggler's ring outside of combat just to help give myself a bonus when I want to pickpocket someone. Then for our amulet, we have the Amulet of the Devout. This is just to give us +2 to our spell save DC, further decreasing the chance that any enemy will succeed a saving throw against our Band of the Mystic Scoundrel spells. So the daggers, or the melee weapons that we're using, are Rhapsody in the offhand and Bloodthirst in the main hand. Rhapsody is a very good dagger. You kill 3 enemies, and then you gain the buff that this dagger offers, which is +3 to your spell save DC, +3 to your attack rolls, and +3 to your damage. Again, you have to kill 3 things to get this, but that's not a very difficult thing to do. It will go away after your long rest, though. The main hand weapon is the dagger Bloodthirst, and we're using this because it will allow us to apply the Aura of Murder debuff to enemies, and Aura of Murder debuff says that enemies take 2 times as much piercing damage. So the question is, why would we use this instead of Bhaalist armor, since Bhaalist armor is much better? And that's actually the reason that I chose not to use it in the build, is because I think it's too good. I remember when I was playing early on, or one of my earlier playthroughs, when I first discovered or acquired Bhaalist armor, I found that it felt the game just became a little bit too easy. I found that, even though I didn't really know what I was doing, I was still able to kind of cruise through the game just because all the enemies around me were taking double damage. And what I mean by that is because Bhaalist armor, how it works is that all the enemies around you, they get the Aura of Murder debuff without you having to do anything. Just by virtue of being in proximity of you, they will take twice as much piercing damage as they normally would. So yeah, it just felt a little bit too overpowered. Bloodthirst, on the other hand, it's a lot worse, which just made it a little bit more interesting. So just quickly going through some limitations of Bloodthirst in comparison to Bhaalist armor. One is that your main hand weapons has to be this dagger. With Bhaalist armor, you can put any great piercing weapon as your main hand weapon. Unfortunately, with Bloodthirst, the main hand weapon has to be the dagger itself, which is a shame, obviously, because the dagger itself doesn't do a lot of damage. In order to actually get someone to have the debuff, you have to land an attack on them. As compared to Bhaalist armor, you don't need to do anything. The debuff is applied to enemies for free. You don't need to land an attack at all. And the attack itself, so that first initial attack with Bloodthirst, doesn't benefit from the piercing vulnerability debuff. Only subsequent attacks will benefit from it. Then there's the issue that only one enemy at a time, the enemy that you hit, will have the debuff applied to them. There are, of course, ways to get around this, but you'll have to kind of arrange your build to benefit from that. So, for instance, if you have Bard, you can use Slashing Flourish to hit 2 enemies at once. If you're a fighter, you can use Sweeping Attack, or if you're a ranger, you can use Whirlwind Attack. But other than that, you're going to only be able to apply this debuff to 1 enemy at a time per attack. And finally, the debuff only lasts 1 turn, so if the enemy survives 1 turn, you're going to have to hit them again with the dagger in order to reapply the debuff to them. So all in all, I think that these limitations make the dagger more gratifying to use, since it forces you to sort of have to do a little bit more planning in how you're going to hit enemies, the order in which you hit them, and find different ways to overcome the limitations of the dagger. So yeah, so how are we going to make Bloodthirst work? So the main paradigm that we'll be following is we hit someone with Bloodthirst, using Divine Smite typically, which will apply the piercing vulnerability debuff to the enemy, and then we will shoot them with Arrows of Slaying. Arrows of Slaying, or any arrows really, will benefit from piercing damage vulnerability because all arrows are piercing damage. And Arrows of Slaying, if you don't know, are arrows that you can steal or buy from vendors that will do double damage to particular enemy types. So for instance, Arrows of Fiend Slaying will do double damage to fiends. And if we have the Aura of Murder or Piercing Vulnerability debuff on that enemy, they'll end up taking quadruple damage from what a typical arrow would normally do. Additionally, this is why we're taking Sharpshooter, because that will give us another +10 to our piercing damage, and in the setting of piercing vulnerability, it will essentially be +20 piercing damage dealt to enemies. So as I said, we're going to be trying to land critical hits with Bloodthirst. And in the situation that Sneak Attack is activated off a critical hit, I do think that this does quadruple the damage, essentially quadruple the damage from Sneak Attack, because Sneak Attack I do think benefits from the Aura of Murder or the Piercing Vulnerability debuff applied from Bloodthirst, even though it's the first attack. And then of course, because it's a critical hit, you roll the damage twice, or you get 2 damage rolls, so it does essentially get quadrupled. So we definitely don't want our initial attack with these daggers, which we're using to apply piercing vulnerability, to be sort of throwaway attacks that did very little damage themselves, and we're only able to apply the debuff to enemies. We want to make sure that the attack itself does a lot of damage, and the way we do that is by Divine Smite, and in particular double Divine Smite. So there are ways to make it so that you land 2 Divine Smites with a single attack. As for the exact criteria to make this work, I'm not 100% certain. I've been able to make it work consistently for myself, but if I had to give you a list of criteria that you have to specifically meet, I wouldn't be 100% confident that it was a comprehensive list, or that all the criteria that I gave you were actually necessary. I found that it has to be a critical hit. You'll need to make it so that your Divine Smite reactions trigger automatically. And I'm not sure, but I think that your enemy needs to be unable to take reactions against you. And so the bow that we're going to be using is the Dead Shot. It decreases the amount that you need to roll a critical hit by 1, similar to Bloodthirst, and it allows you to add your proficiency bonus to your ranged attack, provided that you don't have disadvantage. We are going to be carrying some other bows with us, Gaunter Mail, and the reason we're carrying this is because it gives us the Celestial Haste ability. We're actually never going to use Gaunter Mail during battle. We're just going to buff ourselves with Celestial Haste right before battle. And Celestial Haste, the definition, I guess, of Celestial Haste, or the literal description of it, is that you get 5 turns of haste. You have to concentrate on it, but when the effect expires or when your concentration is broken, you don't suffer the lethargic debuff that you would otherwise experience from the regular haste spell. So although regular haste does last 10 turns, Celestial Haste, you don't suffer the lethargic debuff. And due to this, I've been able to haste myself twice on the first turn. And what I mean by that is, what you'll do is you will cancel the Celestial Haste, and after you've done this, you'll then take a Potion of Speed. So you get the benefit of haste from Celestial Haste spell, you cancel it, and then you take a Potion of Speed. So you get 2 haste actions in a single turn by doing this. Additionally, there are ways that you can even further take advantage of Celestial Haste, and I think this is most apparent in the video where this character that I have fights Answer or whatever, in which he makes 9 attacks in his first turn. So how you do this is, after you've buffed yourself with Celestial Haste before the battle, on your first turn, you essentially, or what I do is I essentially cancel the haste or cast something that will break its concentration. Again, you have to have made 1 attack beforehand. At that point, the game it's kind of a difficult thing to explain, but it seems to me that what the game does is the first attack that you've made will count towards your Celestial Haste action, and once you've canceled this action, the Celestial Haste goes away, but because you've already made an attack, the extra attack is still available to you, even though Celestial Haste has been canceled. And in Honor mode, this is a big deal, because in Honor mode, the only times you get an extra attack for an action is if it's from the very first action of your turn, or from Action Surge. So what we do by canceling Celestial Haste after the first action, and because Celestial Haste's action is our first action in the turn, is that we still get to maintain that extra attack, but because the action has gone away, the remaining non-hasted action from the turn, so the default action, sort of becomes the first action in the turn. And you'll notice this when you look at your little dots at the bottom of the screen. The Celestial Haste dot goes away, and then the second action slot moves into the first action slot, and thus counts as the first action. And so we can get 4 attacks based off of these 2 actions, whereas before we would have only been able to get 3. Now, to make this work, you definitely need to not activate any other sources of extra actions. So you can't haste yourself until you've fully expended all the extra attacks from this. You can't use Action Surge, and you can't activate Elixir of Bloodlust. So you have to expend all the extra attacks, or all the attacks from these 2 actions, before you acquire any extra sources of actions, or else this won't work. If you wanted to really get extra attacks, I could have not used one of those bonus actions to drink a potion of speed. I could have instead, before the battle, thrown down some haste spores or thrown the potion of speed on the ground, so that way my character during the battle could have just walked through the haste spores or walked through the potion of speed in order to haste himself without having to expend the bonus action. So yeah, this build could technically have 10 attacks in the first turn. A fighter or a pure fighter could have 12 attacks in the first turn, and if we're on Tactician, I believe you get 15 attacks on your first turn, kind of doing all these things. And again, the sources of extra attacks for us will be Celestial Haste, Potion of Speed / Haste Spores that were previously thrown on the ground, Elixir of Bloodlust, and Action Surge. Then obviously the bonus actions can be used for attacks as well. So I also wanted to quickly talk about the buffs that I apply to the character before battle. So one of the buffs that I frequently apply is Sanctuary. So one of the reasons that we do this is because we want to protect our character before they make it to. We want to make it to our first turn, essentially. Generally, we will be taking the first turn in the battle because we'll have such high initiative with our dexterity and the armor that we're wearing. But in the event that we don't take the first turn, Sanctuary can help protect our character so they can make it to their first turn. Additionally, Sanctuary is useful for us because we're not going to be ambushing or surprising any enemies. I know that, that would be a good idea. I think all builds would probably benefit from surprising the enemy. However, I like to have I like to go through the dialogue with each of the enemy characters. And also, I'm not sure if ambushing and surprising enemies leads to you becoming an Oathbreaker Paladin, which we obviously don't want to do. We want to stay as an Oath of Devotion Paladin. I think for one of the other buffs that I'll apply, if I remember to do it, is Mirror Image. I think it's a good idea to always apply Mirror Image before a battle. It's especially useful if you want to save your Sanctuary for your subsequent turns rather than use it on your first turn, because remember, if you break your Sanctuary, you can't use it for another full turn. We'll use Celestial Haste on ourselves, we'll use Form of Artifice on ourselves, we'll use Sacred Weapon on the bow, and we will use Oil of Combustion or Oil of Bane on the bow as well. And then we'll use Potion of Flying to increase our mobility, and Elixir of Bloodlust. I think that my character pretty much always has Elixir of Bloodlust on. The moment the character wakes up from a long rest, I have them take an Elixir of Bloodlust. As far as Tadpole Powers go, the only Tadpole Powers I took were Luck of the Far Realms, and whatever Tadpole Power is the prerequisite to Luck of the Far Realms. The reason I only took 2 was because I initially started out with the idea that I was going to do a no Tadpole playthrough, but then like halfway through Act 3 I was just like, screw it, and I just really wanted Luck of the Far Realms, so I just took it. So to pickpocket items from the vendor, the first thing we're going to do is switch to the Silver Pendant, which will allow us to cast Guidance on ourselves. After we cast Guidance on ourselves, we swap to the Cloak of the Cunning Broom, Smuggler's Ring, and Gloves of Thievery. The next thing we do is disengage, which will create a fog cloud via the Cloak of the Cunning Broom. Then we hide in the fog cloud, and then we proceed to pickpocket all the items that we need before teleporting back to the safety of camp before the vendor realizes what we've done. So anyways, hope that was useful, and if not, well, whatever. The end.